Welcome back. Yet another conversation that we're having here on the Transnet podcast series, happening on the sidelines of the 31st Investing in Africa Mining Indaba. If you've just joined us, there's a series of conversations we've been building up on here in this conversation, where we're really taking a look at the reinvigoration of Transnet as a key state-owned entity in South Africa. Beyond that, it's making sure that it's opening up much of its strategy to incorporate the participation of private sector players, not because it's unable to manage the capacity on its own, but in fact leveraging on its infrastructure networks, on its equipment, and of course even leasing some of its assets to make sure that we're able to capitalize on enhancing the opportunities available in the market. We have a few participants who are joining us here on the sidelines of the Mining Indaba at our store, many of whom are listening in and, of course, going to share their feedback with us. But you can do the same too by making sure that you comment, like, and, of course, subscribe to the Transnet YouTube page. But let's delve into another perspective now, one that actually speaks to an opportunity that Transnet as a group and specifically its leasing division have tapped into. Using the assets that they have to make sure that they lease them and open them up to other market participants on a fixed term or short term basis to make sure that fundamentally we capitalize on the opportunity to ensure that we're able to move goods and services more effectively across the country, best enabling its customers. One man who's at the helm of this and responsible for growth and diversification is a general manager joining us now at Transnet to give us some perspective here, Mr. Wilson Mogoba. Such a pleasure to have you, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Firstly, you have a wonderful title. If growth and diversification, it seems like you have a blank sheet of paper and you decide, what shall we do today? Where are the sweet spots of our...
Well, that's my boss's mandate, right? We got to hustle. We got to run the hustle. So we need to look for new opportunities and diversify the business, yes.
Definitely. Let's talk about the growth opportunities specifically when it comes to a Transnet LeaseCo and how this specifically speaks to the growth and objectives that speak to diversification under the Transnet.
Sure. Look, it's a very exciting opportunity, Gugu. It's something we've conceived almost 10 years ago. And essentially the value proposition really lies in leveraging our idle assets, surplus assets, if you will, and finding ways to unlock greater value around it. And so what we identified was an opportunity in the market, if you will, to supply rolling stock to the market. Perhaps let's take a step back. Typically, what the typical setup is in the market is that most railway companies have traditionally owned rolling stock as a capital asset. So it sits on the balance sheet. And unfortunately, over years, if you look across the continent, we've then ended up not really renewing that fleet as we should be, not maintaining it as we should be. And so you have basically created stress in the system where the ownership of rolling stock has become a lot more expensive. And basically, we have less and less assets available. So what we then identified was the opportunity of flipping the market and transitioning away from a model of pure capital ownership to essentially leasing assets. So think of if you need a car, and you're in Cape Town, you don't need to buy a car, right? You can go to Avis or your nearest car rental unit. So we want to run the same model. That's what we created, yeah.
And it makes complete sense, right? Using something that you own and that you have and deriving another stream of revenue from it. For those who might not be familiar with the kind of assets that fall under LeaseCo, maybe add some perspective, because Transnet is a huge group.
Massive group,
Freight,
yes.
port, rail.
Yes.
It's a wide variety of assets, but which ones particularly fall under your mandate?
The particular mandate we have is primarily, we refer to it rolling stock, but it's really a fancy word for locomotives on the one hand, that provides the engine for pulling the train, and then wagons on the other hand, which is where the goods are put, if you will, and then the locomotive pulls it along. So it's the whole setup of the train. Subsequently, we also plan to go into port equipment, but as the first phase, we really started off on just the rail locomotives and the wagons. So that's what we're focusing on right now.
And maybe what's important is for us just to understand where we've come from and some of the progress and implementation of structures that have been made so far to lead us to the progress and the outcomes that we'd like to see under leasing. Talk us through some of the shifts that have been taken place in the short term.
Sure. So I think in the short term, and it's always interesting when you talk to a railway person, what's a short term? Why? We've been around for 100 years plus. Perhaps our lived experience in the most recent past is going back to, call it around 2017, 2018. And there we identified some opportunities to lease certain assets to our neighboring railways, in particular in Zimbabwe and in Zambia. And so what we did in that particular instance is they needed assets. We identified some assets that were not being used, put them through a refurbishment program, and then lease them to both countries. And they've really turned out to be very phenomenal for the delivery, for the value that they've delivered. So that sparked really what we then wanted to do. And then over time, we've always had endeavors where different customers come to us and say, hey, we need some assets to lease on a short-term basis. So I guess against all of that, we then conducted a market study to assess what the real demand was. And the results were absolutely shocking in a good way, because they really...
You have our attention.
What they showed us is that there was a number that I think we had not thought about. So let me just give you an example. We did a study on the North-South corridor. Now, the North-South corridor is one of the continent's most really premier logistics corridors, right? It links the mines in the DRC all the way down to the port of Durban, passes through Zambia and Zim and Alto Eswatini.
And those are substantial markets, right? Just take a look at the mining opportunity that typically happen there.
Exactly. But what's bedeviled, one of the many problems that's faced that corridor is absolutely the lack of rolling stock. I mean, you can count on one hand literally the number of wagons and locomotives that there are. So what the study showed us is that by around 2030, it's about not 4. How many years?
5 years now.
5 years.
2025.
5 years time. By 2030, there's going to be a demand or a need for upwards of about 200 locomotives and over 20,000 wagons just on that corridor. And never mind that that's a very small part of the potential market, right? Because then you now equally have the rail reforms in South Africa, which are absolutely going to spur the demand for rolling stock. So what we began to see was a huge potential for rolling stock, and that's the gap we really are looking to close right now.
Got you. Mentioning those numbers, 200 locomotives, 200,000 wagons, as you say. What's the current capacity that we have at the Transnet freight rail and maybe under leasing at the moment?
No, so under leasing, leasing has never been something we've focused on as a business. We do it on an ad hoc basis, and again, primarily because our rail operating division, Transnet Freight Rail, owns their own assets, right? So they've never had to lease, and it's just their model because they've owned. But they've been in the fortunate position to own assets, and over time, some have become surplus to their requirements. And so what we're looking to do is to take those assets that are not at the core of their business, flip them around. It reminds me of an old show, maybe old, but it is called Pimp My Ride, right? So we're going to pimp the old assets here and really turn them into some serious revenue generating opportunities and serve the market while we're doing that.
100%. You're speaking the language of many of those who are listening right now, and it actually makes a lot more tangible sense, especially for those who might not be involved within the freight rail environment. But what you're highlighting is such a phenomenal growth opportunity in terms of the numbers you've quoted, but we're also on a very tight timeline. 5 years is a very short period of time within the space that we're in.
Yeah.
What does this tell us about the partners and partnerships that you're looking for to make sure that you're well capacitated to meet demand?
So in preparation for that, what our management and board have mandated us to go out to the market and essentially seek partners. So we've undertaken a bankable feasibility study. In fact, I think this Friday we are talking to the board we're talking to our ExCo about the results of that and taking it through our governance processes. The intention is that come the end of March this year, we then go out to market for private sector partners. Let me speak a little bit about the model. So we have the assets as Transnet. So the assets need to be rehabilitated. So we're going to crowd in the private sector to bring in the funding that then is required to rehabilitate the assets on the one hand, and then together we form a partnership that's then going to effectively establish this rolling stock leasing company, and then we grow it together. So it really is a very simple model, right? We bring in the assets, they bring in the cash, we get together, we do the work, and voila, we do business.
100%.
That's what you're going to do.
And speaking of doing business, we can't take for granted that there are a few stakeholders here who might be within the mining fraternity, given that we are at the Investing in Africa Mining Indaba. Help us unpack how this unlocks so much more value for your customers, given the collaborative approach that you're taking.
Yeah, so let's start with what's currently happening in SA. You have rail reform, and I think the one fundamental thing about the rail reform is that it's now opening up South Africa's rail network to new rail operators, right? But if you're going to run a rail operation, in addition to acquiring the slot, which our colleagues in TRIM are managing, the rail infrastructure manager, you then need assets, because you really can't move a train without, or you can't move your cargo without locomotives and without wagons. Just about every single aspirant operator that we've spoken to tells us that it's going to take them at least 2 years, if they were to place their orders today, to acquire new assets. Now, that's 2 years we don't have, right? In fact, our GCE in a session yesterday, I think yesterday afternoon, mentioned it as well. It's going to take the market at least 2 years. And mind you, South Africa is not necessarily the priority when it comes to demand for these assets. So if it's Wilson trying to set up a rail company and I need a handful of locomotives and wagons, I'll possibly be way down the line, because of the volumes that I'm ordering. So chances are even that those 2 years that are projected might just end up taking much longer. What the LeaseCo does, and it's the exciting part, is that it avails assets immediately.
Yes.
So aspirant train operating companies can now come to us and say, we need assets, and bang, we give them to them and say, you're good to go, you can make business work. That's great, because then for the mining sector and all clients who are on rail, it then means that they have immediate access to these services that are so crucial for the turnaround of our economy.
100%.
That's the magic we want to make happen.
You had me at bag, because that's what we want, right?
Yep.
Impact, timelines, and timeframes. We're well aware that yourself and many of your colleagues had really been moving very quickly to make sure that this reinvigoration at Transnet continues at a very quick pace. You mentioned a deadline this coming week in February, but when can we anticipate, operations at LeaseCo to, yield the results and the impact that we want to see in the market?
So the LeaseCo itself, we're doing this in two ways. There's almost, in marketing terms, what they call below the line.
Yes.
So the below the line stuff today is such that what we've been mandated by the boss is to say, where customers need assets today, come to us and we'll avail them. So as I speak to you right now, if a customer wants wagons, they want locomotives, they come, we do a deal with them, and we give that stuff to them if you have it available.
Are you taking calls today?
Hey, we've been taking calls.
That's what we want to hear.
And my boss has been directing all the calls to this. We've been very busy. So that's below the line. The LeaseCo itself, in the form of the private sector partnership, we reckon from March when we issue the RFP, it's then going to take around 12 to 18 months, because it's a lengthy process. We got to run an RFP,
governance,
adjudicate, governance, negotiate with the private sector, and mobilize that whole thing. Google, it's a massive business we are setting up. I'm kidding you not. It is going to be Africa's single largest rolling stock leasing company by any measure of imagination. You're talking of mobilizing a couple of hundreds of tens of thousands of wagons and a couple of hundreds of locomotives. That doesn't exist on this continent. Never mind in SA. So we're putting that, we're trying to make sure we do it carefully, but we're also very mindful of the demand. And so we got to move with speed. So that's the agility that we bring into this whole process.
100%. Opening up the market, making sure that you adequately capacitate your customers, working with key players within the private sector and other participants, and of course, making sure that there's a heightened level of transparency and governance controls to ensure that we operate in an ethical manner. As you said, we're going back. You're taking the calls, you're evaluating the process, and we are working in a phased approach To close off with, Mr. Mogoba, we clearly know that this is a collaborative approach, exploring opportunities and looking for growth. What's your final message to key stakeholders, especially in terms of making sure that we prioritize not only the facilitation, the safety, and of course, active participation that we see as LeaseCo continues to force the way ahead?
I think, to paraphrase the boss in her speech yesterday, we are open for Transnet is open for business, right? So we are absolutely in support of the rail reform. And so we are making sure that we show up in supporting this rail reform, not just because it's good for Transnet, but it's actually really, really good for the economy. The presidency has set a target of 250 million tons on rail. We're not going to do it alone as Transnet, right? So we need that collaboration. So this initiative in the LeaseCo enables us to make sure that we contribute towards that reality. On the other hand, ultimately, I think, as Minister Mantashe was saying in his keynote speech on Monday, it's all about making money. What we are doing here is to provide the means for our customers to make money. If customers make money, then the economy is happy, we employ more people, and we make sure that we uplift the levels of poverty, not just in South Africa, but in Africa in general. So the extent of interest really goes beyond South Africa, because I think when you look at some of the most interesting things that are coming out, this, Google, is a game changer. And that is, we're basically putting it out there and saying, watch out. Come the end of March, I have my matching orders from the boss. We got to go to market, and so we'll be out there.
Pimp our wagons and our locomotives.
Yep.
And go out with a bang.
Pimp our wagons and locos. Yeah, we can get it off by.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mogoba, giving us some insight into Transnet Leasing Company. Very phenomenal opportunity. And as you've heard, not only contributes to the growth of business as well as customers, but ultimately the growth of the economy, not just exclusive to South Africa, but much of our peers across the continent. We wish you all the best and looking forward to further updates. That was my guest today, Mr. Wilson Mogoba, who joins us as the General Manager for Growth and Diversification at Transnet.